Premier Gospel.
It's International Day for Elimination of Violence Against Women, and joining me on this panel are a wonderful group of people. We have Nicola Jacobs, who's the first ever Commissioner for Domestic Abuse, and we have Pastor Mike White, who's no stranger to a senior leader of Tab Church in London. We have Elaine Bowes of the Black Church Domestic Abuse Forum, and also we have Dr. Jan Wilson from East London University, my old university, who's doing a lot of work with the BCDAF. Thank you everyone for joining us to speak about this subject. It is an emotive one, but hopefully at the end of it, we'll have some clarity as to what's happening and where we're going. But if I could come to you first, Elaine, tell us a bit about the Black Church Domestic Abuse Forum, what it is and what it does.
Yeah, so we are a group. We came together actually about 5 years ago, and we're a group of committed Christians, just ordinary Pentecostal Christians who are concerned about the lack of progress or the slowness of our churches to provide an appropriate response to domestic abuse, not only in the church actually, but also in the communities where they have their ministries. So we started to meet informally just to talk about this. And as those discussions, those debates matured, we decided really to set up a forum. And the forum is, it consists of pastors, lawyers, therapists, counsellors, academics, activists, all of these people professional in their own field, but really committed to address the issue of domestic abuse in our churches. And what we've done over the years, it's taken us time because we've thought very carefully about our approach and how we needed to have a position that the churches would rally to. And the first thing we did actually was to develop a toolkit. So we've developed a toolkit based on best practice for addressing domestic abuse across the piece, but is relevant for the churches and based in scripture. And we also use that toolkit to provide training for church leaders and also any other support, because we've also helped churches to develop their own approach to domestic abuse, which we think is best seated really in their existing safeguarding approaches. So it's part of
I want to explore that a bit more. But if I could come to you, Nicole, and forgive me, I know you're non-political, you're not partisan, but for all intents and purposes, for the average person, once you hear the word commissioner, they think you represent the government. And really the question of how, I know this subject it's now political, it's societal, but really how serious is the establishment about this? When you think this particular day has been celebrated for ages, there's a lot of focus on it on the day, but then we have moments like we did recently of Nicole Smallerman and Bilber Henry, and that no sooner as that passed, in all our headlines is Peng Shui, having, according to her, been abused by someone very powerful. And you think, so have we really gone anywhere with all our song and dance about this international day? Hasn't it just remained a day for most people?
Mm-hmm. I appreciate you asking. I think you're right. It marks the beginning of this 16 days of action or activism, and it's one that I think we all need to continue to be active about, because as you say, we're really not nearly where we ought to be with these issues and our understanding and action being taken, and that includes government. I was appointed as the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales. I'm a government appointee, so government did choose me, but we sit independently, and even as part of the Domestic Abuse Act, which passed in late April, it gives a statutory underpinning for our office as independent of government, and really there to both advise and also hold government to account. So I'd please encourage listeners to appreciate. I'm a fairly new commissioner. I'd love for more connection with your audience, and please look out for me and my office on our website and on Twitter, and we'll make sure to send that to you. But the scale of the problem is huge. We have our Office of National Statistics, who survey your average person in England and Wales and asking them, what are their experiences of all sorts of crimes. And what we know is that last year alone, 2.3 million people said that they would have experienced domestic abuse in the last year, not in their lifetime, not someone they know, but them personally. That's a huge percentage of people in our society walking around really suffering and sometimes hiding and being really fearful to talk about what they're experiencing at home.
Sorry, Nicole. So can I ask, the statistic you hear again and again is 1 in 3 women. I remember William Hague quoting that in 2014, and I'm still hearing it today. Is that still accurate?
Yeah, so it stems from those Office of National Statistics, and it's really 1 in 3 in their women in their lifetime. So so the statistics from the past year would give us around about 1 in 10 women. But if you were to extend, that's asking people what they've experienced in the past year. But if you said to women, have you ever had this experience? That's where you start to see the 1 in 3. So it's highly prevalent. There are male victims, and there's victims that have intersecting issues. So people who are disabled, older, there's all sorts of additional needs that we have to think about, and slightly higher prevalence rates, say, for disabled victims of domestic abuse. But in general, I suppose the thing to get across is, in any group, in any church, in any social situation we're in, we should all be expecting that people that we're talking to are highly likely to have either experienced domestic abuse or certainly know someone in that they're very close to. So that's why initiatives that we're hearing about today are so incredibly important, to talk about this, very importantly to know what good practice is, as Elaine was just talking about, understanding safeguarding. Because one of the things that we know, you were mentioning a couple of very tragic murders and cases that have been in the public domain recently, but one thing we know is that people are most at risk within the first year that they may be separating or leaving an abusive partner. And so these are the kinds of things that we need leaders to know, because often people will be seeking advice from people they know and trust, and that's often church leaders or people within the church who have leadership positions. So we have to be very careful to know what risk factors are, what are the services that are out there, who's there in a really good position to help and really advocate for victims to get what they need in these kind of crisis situations.
Pause my point. I'll be interested to know from you in a moment how bad it really is in the church. I mean, Elaine alluded to the fact that we don't do so well in the church, but looking out at the statistics that Nicole just mentioned, it seems the problem is right across the piece. But I want to know from you, as someone who's day in, day out, you're dealing with church people and church leaders, to know your thoughts on that. But before that, Dr. Wilson, you have research that you're doing all the time, which is some of what you support the Black Church Domestic Abuse Forum with. The research you have, the data you have, what story is it telling?
Okay, so what we're coming across, what we're finding with our participants is, especially, and from previous research actually, working with Black or African Caribbean, British communities, is that they don't really speak. Some of those intersections that Nicole spoke about in terms of racism, class, means that these communities tend to be very silent. What we found in regards to the church is that, let me go back. This kind of project was born out of my principal investigator, Ava Kanyurex's work. working with violence against women and girls within these communities. And one of the things that emerged was women said that faith was a key part of them living with such experiences. So then we followed on with this project, the Spirit and Solace project, which looked at how Black majority churches support women and men with these experiences. And what we're finding is that women said that they couldn't cry within their own communities. They couldn't speak of domestic abuse within Black and African Caribbean communities because of this idea around the strong Black woman. So even within our own communities, there's this idea that Black women can't cope with everything. So they would go to church, and it was in the church space that they cried. But they wouldn't really go to pastors, or if they did approach pastors and tell them, they were told that they could pray for them, or that it really wasn't something that the church got involved with because the authority remained with the husband. And so these are the things that are coming out of the research at present.
This is your most recent research that's telling these stories. Well,
this is research we're conducting right now, currently.
Pastor Mike, please let me come to you. I mean, you are a bona fide mega church leader. You travel the world, speak on stages with thousands of people, many of them women. The core of your message is freedom from brokenness, and be free from your past. Yet it sounds as though the data that Dr. Wilson has says those people in the congregation are not enjoying the freedom that you work so hard on stage to tell them about. What is going wrong?
Absolutely. I think one of the key things, Muyiwa, and it's great the way you've unpacked the fact that the church is wide. And I think it's critical. And I've been encouraging colleagues and friends across the globe to ensure that, especially in this 21st century context where we find so many people suffering from this abuse silently, that we cultivate as leaders. It's critical that we cultivate cultures within the congregations of support, of you can tell us what's going on, of we'll be there for you, of you don't need to hide this, and not to over spiritualize something that needs to be practically addressed. The conversations that I just heard Joanne talk about is happening in terms of people saying, look, we'll pray for you, don't worry, you'll get over it, God will bring you through it. This over spiritualizing situations is for me a horrific thing that's taking place, because often what we're sending people back into is what could eventually become a murder scene. And I think it begins with leaders cultivating an atmosphere of freedom for people to be able to speak up and to not, no, they won't be lambasted, no, they won't be just palmed off, as some have told me they have been in certain churches. And that's what we've endeavored to do at the Tab. At the Tab Church, we've endeavored to ensure that there's a culture where people can speak freely. And secondly, we've also realized that we need to develop a preventative policy and what I call a medicative policy. In other words, you need to, when it comes to relationships, from the very get-go, when your premarital counseling, your marriage preparation, your relationship preparation counseling and forums, make sure that in that environment we try and bring these things up, find out about people's histories, not just their sexual history, but also their anger history, their emotional deviant history. And I think this is something that a lot of churches are skimming over, because we get so excited about marriage that we just want to see people just push through into it. But there needs to be a lot of preparation. That's the preventative policy. Then we also have what I call a medicative policy as a church that we've tried to share out to other churches as well. It's what I call, if you'll allow me, the 3 Ds. That's what we use at our church. We talk about, number one, if there ever is a situation where there's domestic abuse, that we stand, first of all, as a church, our policy is to stand in defense of the victim. That's the number one thing. And I think that's empowering, that's freeing, that generally feels like practical support from the feedback we've got. Number one is defense of the victim. That's the first D, the 3 Ds. The second one for us is deliverance of the perpetrator. I think that's critical. It's not just defense of the victim, but I think we also we owe it as a church, as a Christian community, to try and see somebody who submits to help get the help they need, so they don't become a repeat offender, and see them get that's the word we use for it, deliverance, freed, to be freed from the emotional trauma that often is the cause of the lack of control and the emotional abuse being expressed. And then thirdly, the third D is development of the marriage. So that's the decision, though. That's the decision of the victim. If the victim says, yes, I still want my marriage to be developed, that's their decision. We will never force them into that as a church. And I think, again, that's part of the culture that you have to develop. And I want to say something just quickly, Muyiwa, if you don't mind. And that's that it's important also to really understand the theology of a church, because some churches have such a strong anti-divorce theology and anti-separation theology that they're more willing to put people at risk of being, unfortunately, killed, rather than empowering them to have their own freedom and live their life as a valued member of humanity.
Can I ask you this question? One of the things that we've heard from Dr. Wilson and to a degree from Elaine is the lack of willingness for people to speak. And I just wonder, even before we explore the theology of churches, most generally, when we look at people like you and other leaders, we see great men who've got it together. You and your first lady you look swish, you look wicked. The drip is hot. You know, you love each other. You kiss and the stars fall into place. And the parishioners look at that and long for that, wish for that, and they're told from the pulpit that, pray and seek God and everything will be fine. And we see perfection, and then you think, you know what, I can't be perfect like my pastor. So, isn't that part of the problem that they look up at the stage and think, wow, they're so perfect. I wish I was perfect. So then I wouldn't speak.
Well, I don't know whose church you go to, Muyiwa, but it's certainly not the Tab, because because at the Tab, the culture that we've cultivated, and any of our genuine members would be able to vouch for us, that we've cultivated a culture that gives you a context of freedom and also transparency and authenticity. My wife, and we're very open with our church about this, and we're very comfortable to talk about it, grew up as a first-hand witness of severe domestic abuse and domestic violence in ways that just horrific. It bothers me to talk about it, although she's healed from it all, seeing in her own home with her father and her mother. And so we talk about that quite openly on the pulpit. And I think it starts with the leadership. You're right, in the context, it starts with leadership. Leadership becomes a thermometer for the culture. Or I should rephrase it, becomes a thermostat for the culture. We actually set the culture. And so it's important for us to talk freely. And we do that very frankly, very transparently in all our relationship series and workshops and seminars. We bring this up. So it must start with leaders. And as I said at the top end, I've been encouraging many of my colleagues. I'm not saying the Tab Church is perfect, but we definitely have policy. We definitely have culture where there's a freedom and an empowering for people to speak up about what's going on.
Elaine, I want to hear from you some of your testimonials, if any, from the journey of the BCDAF. But Nicola, if I could come to you first of all, in your job as a commissioner, in the first one at that, what have there been any successes? Is there hope for the future? And if there is, where is the hope? Because as we said, I mean, just right now in our headlines is a young lady who she says she's at risk. Her community says she's at risk from a powerful person in government, and other powerful people in government can't seem to do much. Yet we're all being told we must do this and make sure women are not at risk. So you can understand when for some people they just sit and go, another day of, yeah, it's a campaign, it'll be gone, and Betty will get slapped up next door, and it's all part of life.
I think it's a great question, because I feel like I am getting old enough to be able to, I just turned 50 not too long ago, and I've worked here for 20 some years in the UK in relation to domestic abuse. And I think there's huge progress that has been made. So I do want to credit that. I mean, you know, we've had refuge provision or domestic abuse provision really building up over time. Lots of initiative and raising of awareness in all sorts of frontline services, the police, housing, health. There's so many different examples where you can see a lot of progress that's been made. Having said that, there's a lot more we need. So because it's been kind of piecemeal and there's been a patchwork of services built up over time, none of them really ever have core funding. There's a lot of ways that we're held back, and particularly services that have been by and for Black and minoritized communities in particular. You see a lot of those services being excluded from, you know, commission services. And so there's a lot that we need to build up and kind of bed down in terms of a core way that we fund these services. But having said all of that, you know, we've had the Domestic Abuse Act, where we now have a legal definition of domestic abuse. Believe it or not, for many years, we've been just working to an agreed cross-government departmental definition. We now have on the face of the legislation a legal definition that includes children as victims in their own right. It includes things like financial abuse and a whole range of coercion and control, meaning, you know, not only physical abuse as part of our definition. In that piece of legislation, there's all sorts of provisions that have improved the court response, new offenses such as non-fatal strangulation, such as threats of sharing indecent images. There's a lot of steps forward we've made.
Let me interrupt you, Nicole. Forgive me. Let me interrupt you. And those things sound nice. And I'm sure that, I mean, I don't want to belittle the work that you've done, but at the end of the day, you've just highlighted that there are service providers in the communities that you've highlighted as where there are real problems, not getting funding. So the question is, if the data shows that there are real problems in certain pockets, and speak specifically of the African and Caribbean families, and funding is not getting to them, what is the government committing to doing to make sure that this Day of International Day Against Elimination of Violence Against Women is not just another one that we've ticked and we've marked and we've talked, we've great sound bites, great interviews, and it passes?
That's right. The government has, in the Domestic Abuse Act, created a duty for funding for accommodation-based services. Mostly we tend to think of these as refuges. Now, that's a big step forward. But what we haven't done, and what I continually push for the government to do, and my office is mapping all services in England and Wales to try to bring together the data about this, is it hasn't extended for a duty of the community-based services, which is the vast majority of where people go. So there's a lot to be done about that, and my office is working on, you know, the next opportunity for us is very much in a consultation on a victims bill, which will be introduced this year, and the government has set up and will be publishing soon a external consultation, a public consultation on that bill. And one of the points we want to make very strongly is the need for this core funding. I mean, I would say for listeners now, a perfect thing to do during the 16 days of activism is to find out about the local services, in particular, any services for domestic abuse geared towards Black and minoritized survivors or victims of domestic abuse, and see what they need from you. And I would be counting myself in wanting to do that too. There's a lot we can do in the here and now, but certainly you're absolutely right that the government must be clearer that these are priorities and these are core services that the community needs. Otherwise, we're constantly held back, and churches will be held back, but all sorts of community-based services will be held back because they need these services to be in partnership with, to really move forward. So there's huge amounts to do. I just wanted to come back to just very quickly one point you made, which is something we should all embrace in the 16 days, is that you know, whether it's talking about, you know, really prominent cases we're hearing about in the news, one of the things we need to embrace is the idea that we are talking about these things now, particularly during COVID. In the last year and a half, there's a lot more public conversation about the importance of domestic abuse and wider issues of violence against women and girls, and the fact that we know of we are having a public discourse, I would say, is a huge step forward, and we need to make the most of that. And you know, there's a lot to embrace in that we're talking about these things. We weren't doing that so much in past years, and so we need to do more of it. Again, one thing we can all do in the next 16 days is talk to friends and family, people who we think are very influential in their respective work or community, and talk to them about these issues, and ask them, you know, what they might be doing during these 16 days and what we can all do to kind of raise these profiles. And a huge thank you to you and what you're doing in this network, and in the various ways you'll use some of this recording.
Dr. Wilson, I want to know from you what utopia looks like. And I mean, you are an academic, so you're familiar with history, you're familiar with data. Would we ever get to a place where violence against women is eradicated, or is there an acceptable level that it should get to? I want to know that from you. But Elaine, a question for you: with the work you're doing with the Black Church Domestic Abuse Forum, you've talked about, I mean, you've highlighted very clearly the top of the program, some of the gaps and where problems are. Have you and your colleagues seen anything that's encouraged you? Any good news stories? Any case studies that you can point to as hopeful lights in the darkness of this incredible demon that we grapple with?
Yes, I think we can, to be fair. 5 years ago when we started, we were very, I won't use the word nervous because that would be wrong, cautious and careful about the approach, because we wanted the churches to take us seriously. We didn't want the churches to say it had nothing to do with us, or we shouldn't be in this area. So the approach that we finally came up with in relation to the toolkit was very carefully developed over those years to make sure we got it right. And when we did actually finally draft the toolkit, we went through a big process of evaluation and testing before we put it out there. University of East London did an evaluation for us, and we called some pastors and leaders together to test it to make sure we got the tone right and all of that, and before we felt confident actually to go out there. Because at the very beginning, when we started to talk about it, we got, and I started to talk to some church leaders about it. They said nice things. A lot of them said very nice things, but actually nothing happened. Nothing really happened. And we had to go back to it. Now I can say that whilst we're still not getting the level of response we would like to see, it has improved. And I think actually our work really catapulted during COVID, to be honest with you, because the levels and numbers of domestic abuse cases just shot up. And we had calls from churches to help them, to come in and help them to address this.
So forgive me, this may be my autism that's at play here. What I've just heard you say is you expected people not to respond, the churches not to respond. The churches responded. During COVID, they've responded, but I still don't hear from you actually that that, you know, there are cases where, you know, families are, I mean, people who were abused, rescued. I mean, it just seems we're still, 5 years later, we're still in dialogue, we're still talking.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
progress for us?
Well, you know, yeah, 5 years later, we're still in dialogue, we're still talking. For us, from our perspective and where we're working with the churches, there has been an increased interest. We're getting more churches wanting to talk to us. We're getting more churches interested in the toolkit and asking us to work with them. That has happened in that time. And as I said, I think COVID had a lot to do with it. But in terms of is our work so far making that impact, in that we can say there are these numbers of families who have been, whose lives have been saved or improved because of that work? I can't give you that data. I just don't have it. I don't know. What I can say is that we're having a better relationship with churches around it, and more churches want to know. Still not enough. Still not enough. Still not enough. Not by any stretch of the imagination is it enough. But I'm not getting the complete kind of the nice face. This is all very awful. Then nothing happens anymore. And
Yep.
you know, we've got churches who are saying to us, "Come and work with us, and please help us to develop our approach." It's important.
Dr. Wilson, so what for you would be an acceptable place for us to be as a society? Not just the Black church or the African and Caribbean church, or you know, or the African and Caribbean community. And I'm certain you'll say, you know, a place where no woman endures the pain of these. But is that realistic? Would we ever get to that?
I'm not sure. I mean, from my years working or researching this area, at times there is a feeling that we're moving forward and things are changing. But then again, we get thrown back again when reality, when we see with like COVID-19 during lockdown, domestic abuse going through the roof, the mass increase in domestic abuse. I think what we need to do as an academic is look at this situation on a structural level. And I think we need to start looking at the relationships or the gender power relationships. We as parents need to start looking at this. We shouldn't just be giving it out to the government. I think within our own homes, we need to start addressing these things. We need to start unpicking all these things, all these gender norms that we're supposed to be. Men are supposed to be this, and men are supposed to be, and women are supposed to be this. And equally, when you're talking about domestic abuse, we can't just look at it from a female perspective. We can't just say this is happening to women. It's happening to men also. So as Nicole alluded to earlier. But I also think what we need to start doing is listening to the multitude of voices. There are so many voices out there that we have not heard. We're right at the top of the iceberg here. And in terms of service provision, it needs to be a lot more intersectional to acknowledge that. And what we're getting now, and I'm not putting down any of the services out there, they do a fantastic job. One, they're underfunded, but two, we have services out there that come under the BAME provision, where the only BAME provision they have is they give you an interpreter if English is not your first language. It's not good enough. We need to understand from my own work and Dr. Eva Kanyuetsi's work that a lot of women come to services not necessarily with their domestic abuse or their child sexual abuse as the first reason. They come because of the intersectional abuses they're facing daily with them and their families. So we need to see that a lot of, for these women, their abuses come as a secondary concern to their lived experiences. So I think that's the first thing. One of the things that's coming out of the research, again, is that this lack of understanding around what domestic abuse is. People understand what domestic violence is, but they don't understand the myriad of domestic abuse. Like Nicole spoke about, financial abuse, even spiritual abuse. They're not understanding it's coming in different forms. And so I think that one of the things we did with COVID brilliantly was advertise how we all wash our hands. And we need to have that same kind of campaign. We need to push, especially with the new bill, what exactly domestic abuse looks like. It is not just someone hitting someone. And in terms of eradicating domestic abuse or child sexual abuse or any of those abuses, I don't have the answers, but I think we need to work more collaboratively. We need to come together and start speaking and listening to each other. And hopefully we can start tackling this.
I'm going to start, well, I'm going to wind us up because we're wildly over time. So thank you so much for your patience. But of course, it's impossible to deal with. There's such a big subject in the short time we have. So Pastor Michael White, let me come to you. This is a real Goliath that faces us, not just the church, not just the Black community, it's our world. You're a man of a cloth, and you deal not just with the body, the soul, you deal with the spirit. So here we are perplexed, and we look to people like you for words of direction, words of wisdom. What on earth do we do next with this beast? The government, as we've heard, struggling to deal with it. The money's struggling to deal with it. The data sometimes looks good, most times looks bad. In the meantime, women are dying, homes are broken, children's lives are destroyed. And here we are. What on earth do we do next?
Well, just to kind of echo some of what Joanne just said, ultimately, collaboration is what brings transformation. And I think there definitely needs to be local authorities, faith groups, whether it's churches and mosques and synagogues and whoever else, all coming together and taking, I want to go back to what I said earlier, because I think this is critical in the group settings, to set a culture of empowerment, a culture where you can speak out in our faith group settings. And also going something else Joanna just said, which is we found as a church that it's important to teach people what it is, because some people are actually in the midst of it and don't even realize that's why you're dealing with such low self-esteem, depression, whatever else. It's as a result of you not realizing your humanity is being devalued based on how you're being treated in a relationship. And for churches, I want to encourage church leaders. As I said, I'm not claiming the Tab Church is perfect by any means, but what I am saying is that we are determined and committed to consistently keep a culture where people feel they can speak up, and where our theology concerning marriage, divorce, etc., is not overruling our theology of the defense of humanity and the dignity that everybody deserves. Jesus defended the weak, whether it was children, whether it was a woman caught in the act of adultery that everybody wanted to abuse. Jesus stood, number one, in defense of the vulnerable. And I want to encourage all my pastor colleagues across the world who may be listening to this to try and cultivate that correct context in the culture of your church.
Pastor Mike, so there's a teenager listening to this who's just caught a clip on Instagram or just caught a bit on YouTube. They're in a situation where they can't quite understand what's going on, but they know something is not right here, because either their sister always runs off into the room crying, mummy has a breakdown, or maybe it's daddy that's having a breakdown, and they're wondering, is this abuse going on in my home? What do I do? What does this 16-year-old Jeff or Paul or Kola, what does he do next? Because I mean, he's a 16-year-old. Who's he supposed to talk to and not get in trouble at home?
Well, of course, the first thing you want to do is speak to if it's a teenager, I don't know what level of teenage, but speak to a responsible adult, whether it's somebody at school, teacher, headmistress, headmaster. There's a plethora of people out there who will actually have an open ear, or come to a local church if possible. And if you don't feel like you are being heard, because there is a difference between you saying something and knowing that you've been heard. If you don't feel like you've been heard, don't stop. Don't just shut down. I want to encourage you to go ahead and talk to others and raise what you're seeing and ask the questions, is this right? And I'm sure that conversation will bring illumination that hopefully will eventually result in somebody's life being transformed and a situation being corrected.
And let's just go around the table for one final word from each of you on this subject. If I can come to you first, Nicole, one final thought from you, a departing thought.
Oh, I think we've had great advice. I think the only thing I might add to the situation you just asked about was just to be aware that there are confidential helplines. There are places people can call. A lot of times that first reaching out is really hard, and the worry is what unintended consequence might there be. And that's why, because these things are so complex, there are confidential spaces for these kinds of help seeking. So please, no matter what country you may be in, there would be, to kind of have a look and see what confidential helplines there might be. And then that will help you think about who else to talk to as well. And I think you've had some great advice. And I guess the only thing I would say is you're absolutely right about government and the role of government and the collaborative approach we need to take, or Pastor Mike spoke about. I can't agree more. But I think we all in these 16 days have to think, what can I do? Who can I talk to? Maybe it is about reaching out to someone I've been worried about. And I guess I would just encourage people to know that these prevalence rates are so high that no one usually minds being asked. No one minds this being raised anymore. I think we've changed a bit, and all of us, having a bit of courage to say, this is something I care about. How can I help? Or this is something I want to talk about more, is such an important thing that we can all do. So embrace the 16 days and the challenge of the 16 days. In thinking about, they don't have to be huge steps, but what are personal things we can all do? And certainly there are a lot of services out there, and particularly the smaller community-based services that need our help. So whether that's just a small donation, or getting a group together and having a coffee morning and donating, or figuring out what we can all do, there's so many things that we can each do to really take a step forward in these next 16 days. So, and we'll learn a lot doing so. So that's my last comment. Thank you so much for having me today.
Dr. Wilson?
What can we do? Well, following on from what Nicole said, yes, reach out to people. But also, I think one of the things I would advise is make yourself familiar with what actually domestic abuse means. What is this thing? Yes, and start
do that. How can we make ourselves familiar?
Well, I'm sure you can go on, you can just type in on Google, what is domestic abuse? And it will all come up. But I also think as the new bills come out and we have these 16 days, it should be everywhere. The same way washing your hands was with COVID, domestic abuse should be splattered everywhere. So I think that's one of the key things. Another thing I would like to add in terms of the study is that we are trying to engage churches, but churches are not forthcoming. I have on a database, I have spoken to so many pastors who've agreed to take part in the study, but then have not taken part in the study. So I'd like to ask Pastor Mike, maybe for some support there, or his views on why that is. Maybe in terms of, because we're looking at domestic abuse within Black churches, maybe a sermon or two. A sermon about domestic abuse. Yeah, maybe that's right. Push that out to the pastors.
Pastor, one final word from you.
Well, I want to say we're thankful for the amazing work people like Elaine is doing with her team. And thank you, Joanne, for bringing up the point about the fact that this needs to be splashed all over the place. And I agree 100%. What I would say, I would say that we need to talk about survival. That you can survive. Life can get better after you talk about what's going on in your life. We've found that fear has often hindered people, thinking if I talk about it, it's going to be the end of my life. Nobody will like me, my life goes into the dumps, etc. And I think having some domestic abuse survivors profiled is going to be a really good thing, because it will help people know there is life after the process of reporting this, and that will encourage others to speak up as well. So 100% behind all that's been said. And I believe, more sermons, more talking, more conversation. And I want to encourage all my pastoral colleagues across the globe. Let's set a culture in our churches where men and women feel empowered to speak up about what's going on.
And a final word from you, Elaine.
Thank you, Moya. I agree with everything that's been said. But do you know, one of the things that I would really like, and it's part of the work that we're doing at BCDAF, is that that we recognise, and the churches themselves recognise, the power and the importance of their influence in communities to make a very real difference to eradicating domestic abuse. The churches are so influential, so powerful in terms of what they can do. They need to recognise that themselves, that this is something that is about them and not something happening outside of church, and we're out there and it's got nothing to do with us for lots of reasons, but I won't go into that. But I also would like the funders, the government, to also recognise how important our churches are in our communities, to address that and to support the work that people like the BCDAF, organisations like BCDAF and others are doing to rally, if you like, the churches around this, because it's really very hard work, very tough work. With
one last question for you, Elaine. So the International Day kicks off, and then there are 16 days of activism that Nicole's talked about. Can people find information about that on your website? And if not, where should they be looking for more information about what they can do in those 16 days and beyond those 16 days?
Yeah, we're starting a campaign of promotion from the 25th about, about this 16 days of activism. And ourselves, we are actually also looking to extend this debate during those 16 days to look at the kind of things that Pastor Mike was talking about, which is relationships. And also young people. One of the things we haven't spoken so much about is how high the level of domestic abuse is in young relationships. So we're actually looking at, and that's where our own work has been evolving to, actually, relationships, young people, and starting to bring this debate. So we are ourselves extending that debate during these 16 days of activism to try and do that. Yes, but from the 25th, there will be information about that on our website, and also in terms of our social media and what people can do to get involved and to make a difference.
Elaine Bowes of the BCDAF, thank you so much for joining us. Pastor Michael White, Senior Pastor of the Tab Church, thank you. Dr. Wilson, University of East London, and Nicole Jacobs, Commissioner for Domestic Abuse, thank you so much for joining us on Premier.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Muyiwa.
Thank you.
Premier Gospel.